to all of you. So, this is going to be very educational, if you wish. So we are going to look at 3 topics. First of all, giving some definitions in order to make sure that we are all on the same page. Then I will give you a certain number of examples to show you how CSR is part and parcel of the company strategy. And also, we will look at a certain number of challenges and questions for today. Let's start with a riddle. You can see it on the screen in French. In the world, how many consumers do you think are willing to reward companies which have a socially responsible approach when they do their shopping? Do you think it's 20%, 50%, or 75%? And which country do you think is first in that ranking? Do you think it's Denmark, Germany, Brazil, or India? And what we see is that actually there are 50% of consumers who've been surveyed by Nielsen in 58 countries who are willing to make this commitment. And is this a surprise? Maybe not for Ashoka. It's India that comes first, with 75% of the people who would be willing to buy products from a company that is socially responsible. France is not doing so well, but this is not really a surprise. And the conclusion from that is that today companies no longer have the choice. Not really. Corporate social responsibility is not an option. Consumers have massive expectations, especially consumers under 30, but it's also the case of investors and employees of companies also. And it is also the case of many NGOs who are involved with companies. Now, a few definitions to make sure that we all understand what we're talking about. First of all, R for responsibility. Responsibility, it's 2 things. I'm responsible for what I do, I'm aware of that, but it's also responsibility that can be challenged. So for companies, it can go beyond their legal liability. And then there's C for corporate. Corporations are part and parcel of society, interacting with a whole set of players. And the stakeholders, as we call them, there are a certain number of areas. Just to make things clear, there is a point that has to do with HR, of course, the way you manage people at large, so that can be subcontractors as well. Then there's the question of human rights. That's the idea that the company should be in a context of a state of law, even when there is no such thing. Impact on society, and of course this includes the environment. Corporate governance, of course. Relationship with shareholders, governance, and behaviors on the markets, with a relationship to suppliers and clients. So there is a definition of corporate social responsibility by the European Union. Corporate social responsibility is the responsibility that corporations have towards their impact on society. And as you can read on the screen in French, unfortunately, it's a very precise, very elaborate definition, as Europe can do very well. So you might want to read it. It says that the companies have to engage in close collaboration with the stakeholders. Sorry, the interpreter did not even have time to read it in French. And then you have a certain number of other points, community of values, and potential negative effects. So you see that there is a very high level of ambition, and we need to make sure that there are no misunderstandings. The first potential misunderstanding is that if you just highlight a few good things that you do and positive actions that you do outside of the company, such as social sponsorship, for example, That would be corporate social responsibility. Well, no, that's not what it's all about. It's something else. You really have to apply some critical elements to your own strategy. You need to make sure that CSR is part of your business model. It's not just about giving some money away and doing some good deeds once in a while. Then the second thing that I've heard very often at the beginning of Novetic, at the beginning of the 2000s, maybe some of you are still facing this, or have been thinking this, why not? You know, in my company, we've been doing good things about the environment, even without being aware of it, without mentioning it. We were always respectful of our clients and so on and so forth. Well, no, a CSR policy is not only based on communication on what you already do. CSR means working on the long term on a strategy. The other question that we often get is, yes, of course, this is what we say, but then in actual facts, companies actually basically paint themselves green, and they highlight exaggerately one or two things that they do. Well, yes, it can happen, but it's becoming more and more difficult for companies to do that. For example, in October 2012, a judge in Nanterre sentenced Toyota to not broadcast a whole number of commercials because there were those cars that were presented in a natural environment, and so this was not right. And today you cannot actually claim that a product has positive impact on the environment if it's not true. Now, in social terms, there's one of the latest smartphones by Samsung that got a label, TCO certification, and Samsung advertised a lot about this, even though they were accused of recruiting underage children, of making people work extra hours without being paid, etc. So, of course, you're going to buy your new cell phone and you might be tempted to buy it because it's got this certificate. But actually, if you dig a little deeper, you realize that this certificate is only very superficial, with very little audit of the actual practices of Samsung, and a whole series of specialized experts in Europe and in Asia have asked this TCO certification authority to review their methods because they thought that Samsung did not deserve this. So greenwashing and social washing are dangerous and risky practices, and you've got to be very, very careful when you communicate about the environment. You have to always bring evidence for what you're saying, and you always have to be liable. Now, the second part of my talk here is CSR a constraint imposed on companies? Well, you have a whole new series of demands which are imposed on the companies, or could CSR be used to improve the business model of companies and to help them grow their business? Well, there are two ways of looking at this. You could look at the risk and you could look at the opportunities. Very often, you only look at the side of risks. And indeed, CSR brings a lot in terms of anticipating and controlling the risk, because, environment-related risks tended to be underestimated 20 years ago, but now they are clearly taken on board because we know that they will have consequences, sometimes sooner than we think, sometimes later than we thought. So they will have consequences on the environment. And in that case, a CSR approach enables you to conduct your stress tests to better anticipate and to better mitigate the risk. It's true when there is an accident like the one in Bangladesh, for example, recently, with that building that crumbled. Well, in that case, we were able to demonstrate that some famous European companies were directly related to that. And so it's not always the case, but sometimes you have reactions from consumers and investors that can be very violent, very fierce. So a lot of examples related to risk, as I just said, but let's try to see the opportunities. In Novetic, we have of course, a website which is available to everybody, and you will find a lot of examples on the risk aspect of CSR. Now, let's look at strategies and opportunities. We know, I'm sure a lot of you know, that Danone is a company that has had a CSR strategy for quite a long time. For the past 5 years, they've been working in depth on how to reduce their carbon footprint, meaning that they have to measure the carbon the consumption of a lot of products, and they include, for example, the consumption of your fridge, in which you have 4 Danone yogurts. I hope that you don't only have those 4 Danone yogurts in your fridge, and so they have to measure the share of greenhouse gases which are produced by the fridge, but proportionately to the Danone yogurt. So then it means that some good practices have to be implemented throughout the chain of value, and they have achieved very significant results with dramatic drops in their CO2 emissions. So, how did they do that? Well, of course, they try to improve the production conditions, and of course, farming has a lot to do in that, because you know that cows actually produce a lot of greenhouse gases, methane that is, and then they came to rethink their packagings and their transportation chain and then their distribution channel also. Another interesting example is Unilever. I'm going to tackle this from a different angle. This is a very global strategic approach. Unilever's sustainable plan aims at doubling the size of the company while decreasing the carbon footprint and the environmental impact. 1 billion people acting to improve their health and well-being have the impact of Unilever products and use 100% of farming materials which have been produced in fair and equitable conditions. So you see that this is very constraining and very significant. And this strategy is based on a narrative from top management, which is very different from what such a multinational company might have said 20 years ago. It's a new model of responsible capitalism. And the idea is that success will depend on their determination to change their approach, to give up a certain number of obsolete business models, and while considering company as being part of the company, as having a long-term vision, and as meeting expectations which are not only the shareholders' expectations. And so, of course, you might think, oh, well, these are very general principles, but there is a strategic plan, and they have set up a lot of operational actions in the field. You know, Novetic has gone to Kenya to investigate the tea farming, and with the Rainforest Alliance, we found that there's a label or certification which includes 200 criteria, which has been allocated to Lipton Tea, which is part of Unilever. So they do things. And of course, there is no such thing as the ideal company. Not all is that rosy, because companies also have their flaws and they can be criticized, of course, because anyway, they have so many constraints and so many things that they have to do that they have a very narrow room for maneuver, but they have different strategies. I gave you some examples related to the environment, but there are also other examples in the social area, human resources, very interesting things. And this is one example among many others I could mention, the diversity policy of a bank, Société Générale. What does it mean, diversity in a company? Why would a bank become involved in diversity? Well, what Société Générale says is that, first of all, they have to face the employees' demands. These people want to be committed, and for them it's important, and they are present in a lot of countries, and they think that their employees have to mirror the diversity of countries that they are present in. So, of course, this also includes the number of women in top executive functions, the glass ceiling that has to be broken, and gay people, especially in London, because this is really where they had a problem. And another sensitive issue that you might have read about in the media. Look at this thing happening in Bangladesh right now, but I'm looking at this under the point of view of an NGO, RHSF, Human Resources Without Borders. They are involved in social audit, and they consider that they have to support the subcontractors to be in line with the companies who want to become socially responsible. Now, CSR is evolving and changing all the time and very rapidly. Let me give you an anecdote. At the beginning of Novetic in 2003, you know, Novetic is a subsidiary of the Caisse des Dépôts, the CDC. And, you know, of course, the CDC is interested in us because they are a large institutional investor, and CSR has become a strategic issue for investors. But one day, several members of the board of CDC came to me and they said, "There's obesity. You're interested in obesity at Novetic? I don't see the point. Why should we care? How are we interested in that? Because it's public health." And then I had to educate them. I had to tell them that it is something that is becoming a strategic issue and something that has that is very important for companies and that they want to be involved in, including for marketing reasons. And also, there's the evolution of the financial sector. You know, at the beginning, the world of banking and insurance was considered to be very virtuous in terms of their corporate and social responsibility because they have very little impact on the environment. Their social policies are usually quite good. And then, recently, this has been totally overturned because people have started to question the impact of banks and major investors just because of what they do, because of some controversial projects that they fund, just because of what is in their portfolio, just because of the carbon risk related to the fossil fuels that they're involved in. And so there were a lot of questions about the scope, about the limits of the responsibility of the people funding something. And then, one of the recent evolutions, which echoes the environmental conference that took place recently, especially everything that happened following the national debate on energy transition here in France. Well, it's this issue of energy transition, new business models, new practices that would take us towards a low-carbon economy. Oh, no, don't clap now. I'm not done yet. And then, something which is very important also is reporting. When you have so many actions, so many practices, the question is, how can you measure this? What are the metrics? How can you benchmark companies? That's a question that investors and shareholders ask themselves because they're used to reading financial reports. And this is a key question for CSR. France was one of the forerunners because we had the LME law LRE law in 2001. So there are actually few formal constraints that should generate reporting that makes sense. The Grenelle de l'Environnement put this on the table again. So there were a lot of talks and discussions about this, and now we have a European directive talking about reporting of companies with more than 500 employees. So things have changed a lot in that respect. Now, reaching my conclusion, just in a few words, I would like to tell you that if you're interested in this topic, and I guess you are, since you're in this room, you will find thousands of articles on the Novetic website, which are free to read. so you can have some information. And then you see there are reporting obligations and the risks for their brand image. Companies no longer have the choice. They have to go for CSR. And they have to face this world which is more and more complex, so it's becoming more and more difficult to manage a company because of all this. And they also need to take into account a certain number of positive and negative externalities. But the question is, can they do it? Aren't we placing too many constraints of them, especially when you look at competitors from China or Brazil, anywhere outside of Europe and North America, for that matter? Well, this is a question, because CSR also has constraints. So the good news, however, is that there are a certain number of things that can be done in order to handle this in a positive and constructive way, with practices which are also positive for the company. And there are new business models that can be implemented that anticipate on some strategic challenges for the companies. And so when I was talking about energy transition, shifting towards business models which consume fewer resources, well, this is really something that companies can work on in order to better position themselves in terms of competition for the future and in order to better face the future. Thank you.